Alrighty, hi everybody. My name is Morgan and I'll be moderating today's conversation about 5 new obligations under CPRA and the implications to your business. We'll give people just a minute to trickle in here, but in the meantime, if you're new to Transcend, we're the platform that helps companies put privacy on autopilot, making it easy to encode privacy across an entire tech stack. Joining me today are Daniel Goldberg and Brook. Daniel, Ben, would you like to introduce yourselves?
You want to start, Ben? Go for it.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. Ben Brook, co-founder and CEO here at Transcend. Started the business just over 5 years ago with the mission to make it simple for businesses to give their users privacy choices, comply with complex global privacy laws in the process of that, and really sort of adopt the spirit of the law. And we do that by actually connecting to companies' data systems and really offering businesses solutions that automate a lot of these really complex processes, which I'm sure we'll dig more into today. But in the meantime, I'll pass it over to Daniel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Goldberg, chair of the Privacy and Data Security Group at Frankfurt, Kurnit, Klein, and Selz. We're a law firm that specializes in technology, advertising, and entertainment. Privacy is a huge issue right now, and dealing with CPRA and what that means for businesses is a top concern for many of my clients. And so one of the big things we're trying to think about is not just the legal framework, but how do you operationalize the compliance? And so Ben and I have had chats over time, and we thought it made a lot of sense to get together and have this conversation to kind of put the legal and the operationalizing compliance together, because so many companies are having questions about how do you interpret the law and what do you actually do. So I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for Transcend for putting this together.
So I'm sure, as we all know, the modified regulations have quite a bit to them, but today we'll be focusing on 5 new obligations, starting with section 7002, dark patterns, do not sell or share, frictionless opt-out, and then consumer requests. And it looks like we've got a good amount of people in here, so let's go ahead and get started. Daniel, this first one's for you, starting with section 7002. Let's see, so I've actually read this section in some detail for a recent guide we published and was struck by the fact that it seems both detailed and opaque. You know, there's a lot of great examples, but the words reasonable and proportionate seem very open to interpretation. So what's your take on this section?
So part of the way that this whole discussion today came about is that I actually put together a blog post a few months ago, back, I think it was in February, talking about top 8 considerations for operationalizing CPRA compliance. And for those of you here, I think it'd be helpful if you take a look at that as well, because it has a lot of my thoughts about what this means. That's available on our blog. But section 7002 is the #1 item that I talked about. And I think it is the #1 item on a lot of people's minds, because it is an interpretation of the statute that goes into far more detail than anything we've really seen before. So just looking at what the actual underlying statute says is, it says, processing must be reasonably necessary and proportionate to achieve the purposes for which personal information was collected or processed, or for another disclosed purpose that's compatible with the context in which the personal information was collected, and it cannot be further processed in a manner that is incompatible with the purposes. Okay, so that's a lot. That's a very dense section. And when you break it out, the way that I read it and the way that I see the interpretation of 7002 is it's really broken into 3 parts. And we have them essentially here, Morgan, as you put. The first one is disclosures. So anything that you essentially intend to be doing with respect to processing of personal information needs to be disclosed. And that should be going in your privacy policy. #1, 2. Okay. #2 is this concept of what we're calling the reasonable expectation or compatibility test. They're not actually defined as tests, but that's how I look at it. Where essentially, in order to engage in processing, for anything you do, you have to meet one of these 2 tests. And the reasonable expectation test has a number of factors that go into this, and I can talk about that in a few minutes. We can dive in. There's also this compatibility test. And the idea is that when information is collected, it must meet the reasonable expectation of the consumer. If down the line you decide to add an additional purpose, then that purpose must be compatible with the original expectation of the consumer, which is, again, what we're calling the compatibility test here. So looking at those items together, if it passes one of those two tests, then essentially you can do it subject to additional obligations. If it doesn't pass that test, you need opt-in consent in order to engage in the processing. And that's what I think has been a wrench thrown in for a lot of companies where they've said, oh my gosh, like, does this mean now that I have to get opt-in consent for all these processing operations that I didn't think I would have to before? I thought I would just have to do the opt-out. So it's a really good question. It hasn't been tested yet about what that means. And the last part of this, Morgan, is this reasonable and proportionate test, which is basically saying that in all instances, whether or not you need opt-in consent, the processing must be reasonably necessary and proportionate to achieve the purpose. And that's not that different than what we've seen under other statutory regimes. So, you have to look at the minimum amount of personal information, the possible negative impacts, and then weighing that against any safeguards that you've put in place to see whether or not you can proceed with the actual processing. So look, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm happy to dive in more. But I think, Ben, you probably have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like my sort of role in this webinar will be mostly about the operationalizing component. So like how companies are putting this into practice and what best practice can look like there. And so when I think about like our customers and how they are approaching this, there's kind of like three separate pieces here. So the first thing, of course, like disclosure, I think is relatively straightforward in terms of how one discloses. We generally recommend that there are kind of two avenues for disclosure. One is, of course, a central privacy policy that can be found at any point in the user's life cycle. That's typical. We typically will recommend having like a privacy center where an individual can go to basically get all of the information relevant to privacy rather than having to sort of like track down like a bunch of disparate policies across the site. The other avenue is through like embedded disclosures. So like disclosure at the point of collection, maybe there's a new sort of feature that the user is about to start using, or they're about to submit a contact form or otherwise essentially send more of their data for one of these new purposes. That's an important place to also sort of embed disclosures throughout that user journey. And so typically these correspond to like privacy policies and like banners, or preferably rather than a banner, try to like embed it more nicely into the product. Then there's, I think, two other components like to actually operationalizing. So to actually have this mapping of like, here are all of the pieces of data that we're collecting. It really starts with getting to a point of having some sort of data inventory. And in order to actually have an understanding of like which things have reasonable expectation, which things have passed our compatibility test, it all kind of starts with understanding where you're collecting data across the business and for what purposes are you using it. So this kind of brings to mind for me a lot of the groundwork that we may have laid with GDPR and other laws, where we're asking ourselves like, are we relying on consent, legitimate interest? What are all these different sort of purposes of processing that for this data that we're collecting? And so there's some established processes around mapping that data. To the extent that that is something that can be automated, it should be. So we typically will advise our customers to use as much scanning tooling as possible in this domain, because first of all, it's heavyweight to be trying to log everything manually to collect this, sort of questionnaire-based information of what data is being collected. And second, it's just never complete if it's questionnaire-based. There's always huge gaps in the knowledge of the organization. And then I think the third here is, of course, having some operations around impact assessments. For me, sort of compatibility test that Daniel mentioned feels a lot like something that fits nicely into the sort of existing course of impact assessment. And so just ensuring that like those questions are being asked at the appropriate points in this like development journey. So, you know, we're going to launch this new feature. It's going to collect all this personal data and do all these great things with it. Awesome. Let's take a beat and just understand exactly what the privacy impact of that is before it gets shipped. So those are the three sort of avenues that there's like embedded and central disclosure. There's the data inventory, and then there's the impact assessments, each of which are like operational things that each of our customers will typically be doing for section 7002.
And so, Ben, that was really helpful, and I agree with everything you said. Just a few more thoughts on that.
Yeah.
First off, when you're talking about embedded disclosures, the legal term that we see is often is like just-in-time notice. So I think that that is that concept there to say, again, if you're doing something else, you can actually disclose that just in time. And there are certain types of data processing, especially if you're trying to collect sensitive data, that really do require this just in time or enhanced notice. That is something more than just having it hidden in the privacy policy, you know, or hidden, whatever you want to say it. But we just need to be very careful about that. It doesn't want to be something that lives there. With respect to data inventories, I agree. You know, historically, I've seen a lot of clients that are like, hey, can you send us over a questionnaire for an audit? And then they do this questionnaire. And the problem is that it's not a living, breathing document. It's something that takes place once in time, and then no one looks at it for 2 years again. And the original people who conducted it are no longer there. So my clients are always looking for solutions to say, hey, look, how do we do something that is more than just a once in time? So I do think having that is very, very important with respect to the audit. And finally, your point about impact assessments, completely agree. And this is something I wrote about. So, and one thing that also facilitated this conversation is around this concept about harmonizing compliance. So you mentioned GDPR, all these laws. Wouldn't it be nice if we just had like one law, global law that everybody could agree to? We're agreeing to GDPR or whatever it is. Here's the standards, but it's not like that. And you know, today's session we're talking about CPRA, but as I assume pretty much everybody on this call knows, right? We are dealing with a lot of laws now. So not only do we have GDPR, but we have, you know, Connecticut, Virginia, Colorado, Utah, we have Iowa coming, we potentially have, I think it's Indiana, like there's so much stuff. There's this new Washington state law, and many of these laws require these impact assessments and have set out guidelines. So what I've been saying is to integrate elements of these reasonable expectation / compatibility tests and the reasonable proportionate test into the DPIA process, I think is really going to help companies down the line. California has not yet released what I'm calling, you know, part 2 of the regs. So that is supposed to have an analysis about or description about what you're supposed to do for impact assessments. That's TBD. But I am hopeful that when they draft it, they will take into account some of the elements here, and they will say these elements here for the expectation test and the, you know, the various tests are actually intended to be part of the DPIA process. Colorado in particular has a very, the Colorado regs has a very specific process for DPIAs. So those of you on this call should be looking at that as well, because, you know, the specifics, it is very, very robust.
No.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for those detailed breakdowns. As Daniel mentioned, the section does have a lot to it. So if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them towards the end. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to dark patterns. So Daniel, dark patterns are one of the more visible aspects of compliance, but to my mind are also one of the easier pieces to make sure that you're addressing correctly. So what do the CPRA regs say about dark patterns, and how is this different from CCPA?
So I would say, Morgan, it may be one of the easier things to do, but we get pushback from marketing teams because they say, well, if you do it this way, then consumers are not going to use our product, or they're going to choose not to provide the consent or make a decision. And that is the exact intent about why the language is drafted as it is. So we've seen a lot of movement recently in the context of dark patterns. Specifically, we're going to talk about CPRA today, but the FTC has issued statements around dark patterns. We've seen other state laws have language around dark patterns. It's not just in the privacy context, it can be in the advertising context as well, and other contexts. So just really important to know. But the way that I really see it under CPRA is it is intended to be focused on these user interfaces. And this is a great example you have here, Morgan, of like the cookie consent that says allow all, where there's no other option, right? So a dark pattern is essentially under CPRA regs, an interface that substantially subverts or impairs the autonomy, decision-making, or choice of a consumer. And as you've laid out here, these are the 5 things that CPRA is saying that a interface needs to have in order not to be a dark pattern. It needs to be easy to understand. Like that's pretty clear about what that should be. It should be clear, but it's not always clear what you're doing. So be very careful in that. It needs to be symmetrical in choice. So that's a really good example. And I think that goes to the, the sample that you have here. If you're going to say allow all, you should have a separate button that says reject all next to it. And that way it is symmetrical. It should not be coercive. So, or in a way that could be confusing. And the issue with that would be, let's say, for example, you have toggles around do not sell, which we'll talk about later, but it says, on or off, do not sell my information. Like, what does that mean? Are you opting out, or are you saying do not sell, like selling is on? That could be very confusing. Avoid architecture that impairs choice. So this is a really interesting one because the regs talk about that you're not supposed to bundle things together. You have to be really careful on that. So again, if you're going to say we're going to be using whatever it is, this type of cookie, that should be separate choice, maybe analytics from targeted advertising cookies, et cetera. It should be broken down specifically. Just saying, hey, I agree to the privacy policy is not necessarily sufficient to say you have choice for everything. And then finally, it should be really easy to execute and use. So for example, no broken links, no waiting on a web page. I've dealt with that before where I click opt out and there's like a little spiral, waiting symbol. And I go, okay, I'm waiting. I'm just clicking out of this already because I don't want to wait. That would be a problem with it. So again, if you fail to meet these obligations, your consent could be considered a dark pattern, which means it is not valid, which is a problem. So that, and I'm sure, Ben, you can talk more about, what you're thinking about with design and everything in the interface. But this is what I'm thinking about when I talk to clients about looking at their consent management as rolling out with their products.
Yeah, that makes sense, Daniel. And actually, Daniel, maybe we can just spend a quick beat on like how often, or like, in my understanding, there's actually far fewer scenarios where a pop-up is even necessary under CPRA. And so maybe we can like just spend a beat on that. Like when we're talking about dark patterns, we're mostly thinking about like the opt-out flow rather than like this sort of like, do you accept all kind of consent banner? Do you have, are you able to spend just a second?
Yeah, that's a great point. We talked about this before. So one of the really big confusing things, and actually I just was quoted about this recently, is talking about cookie consent banners. So cookie banners are a requirement under a European privacy law. It is actually not a US privacy compliance obligation. But the problem has been is that a lot of these technologies that many of my clients work with are focused on GDPR compliance and EU compliance and are built with these different regimes in place. So what I've seen are US companies rolling out these cookie banners where it's just like a small pop-up that talks about the cookies, but like it doesn't really address anything, right? Because it's not really functionally dealing with the do not sell. And if anything, you're adding language on there that could be deemed to be confusing. And it doesn't, could constitute a dark pattern here. So actually, I tell clients that they need to be really careful if they're going to roll out a cookie banner in the US, because again, not only is it not required, but I think that there's a position that could be taken to say it is actually more risky to have a cookie banner in the US than to not have one, and instead rely on what the law says with having the links in the footer, which is really the proper way and what the expectation, what regulators are looking for.
Yeah, that's the way we've been moving as well. So I find there's to your point, there's like a lot of GDPR inertia in terms of like the way projects are being run. And so it's sort of like, how can we repurpose this existing thing in Europe for collection of consent into this opt-out flow? And the truth is there's some components that translate, but others that you really need to think from the ground up, like in like a US first mindset of, this is usually a flow that's initiated by the user. So we're not sticking it in front of their face when they land on the site. Instead, it's like in the footer that they can initiate this opt-out flow. And so for our customers, we'll typically see them use our solution here to essentially create a more sort of embedded opt-out flow. And each of those will have some like specific patterns. So one option we see is the do not sell or share button on the footer or link is not a link to another page that takes you into a form, but rather it is the button itself. And so you click it and then it just basically pop confirms and says you've been opted out. The reason for this is you as a company, you need to be able to honor the opt-out signal anyway. And so you have to have like a non-form based way of opting out. And so having that button available, which is a one-click opt-out, is very much the opposite of the dark pattern. And once the user is clicking on that link, they're going all the way anyway. And so there's no point in like having hurdles. We make that like as frictionless as possible. And then other customers who have more choices, like sometimes there's more with like sensitive information and other components. That's when clicking on the footer link, which may in this case now say like your privacy choices, as we've seen, this can then pop up like a preference manager. It says various components of do not sell, limit use of sensitive information, and so forth. So there's a couple patterns that we see, but I completely agree that like the core of the friction is not like whether it's not the implementation of the UX pattern. It's more of an internal struggle with marketing of we don't want to see our analytics get nuked, right? But the good news is it's nowhere near the same magnitude as it is in Europe. Like I think in Europe where you're asking for opt-in consent, that friction with marketing is going to be like orders of magnitude more serious. Whereas in California or in really any of the US state regimes now, we see like opt-out rates are relatively low. GPC signals are like 2 to 3%. So that's like not a meaningful change for the marketing team, not compared to like maybe a 50% reduction that you'd see in Europe. So this one for me, it really feels like legal has the opportunity just to say like, we're not going to do any dark patterns in California. Like this is a 2 to 3% hit for marketing, and like the ability for us to actually truly comply with like the letter and spirit of the law here. So I think it's like in California, it's an easier decision, even if there is still friction.
What I think is interesting, what I have issues with is that the way the law was written, I think the intent behind the law is good, but the terms used are not good terms. So like they used the term sale, then they decided to add this term share, which really is in the context of targeted advertising. I wish they would have just said you have the right to opt out of targeted advertising. because of processing data, which is actually why I like some of the other state laws that we've had, especially following like the Virginia framework. It's very clear about what they're trying to say. But under California, they use these terms. And so a lot of times what I've found is it's not that the client is saying we don't want to have opt-outs. It's that we don't want to use the do not sell language because we don't sell data and we don't want to represent to our customers that we sell data. And I see this especially in situations in, you know, services in the financial services or in healthcare or something where they are doing targeted advertising, but they're like, we would never sell data, and that creates all this issue. So there is this friction. I think that's getting better. But to your point, Ben, one of the things, and I think Morgan, we're going to talk about it in a second, is the regs talk about that you can have this alternative link saying your privacy choices in the footer. And a lot of companies are moving toward that now. And I actually really like that because I think that helps move away from this concept of saying, oh, we have to say we do not sell, and rather saying, here are your choices. And then there's an explanation, you know, what we mean by sell. It's unfortunate that that is the term that was used in this statute, but it is what it is.
Yeah. It was like sell is not specific enough, and then share was like just overly broad sounding. Yeah, I completely agree. They're odd terms.
Great. So you guys touched on our next topic a little bit already, but diving into do not sell or share and opt-out preference signals specifically. So under CCPA, it kind of seemed like there was some debate as to whether honoring opt-out signals was required. And now with the Sephora settlement and other actions, it seems very clear that that's not the case. So Daniel, what do the modified regs say about the need to honor opt-out preference signals?
So the regs are very clear on this. They say, even though there is some confusion in the statute about whether or not signals are required, we are expressly telling you that you must allow for opt-outs through preference signals. You know, whether or not that is challenged in court remains to be seen, but the writing is on the wall. I mean, that is what it is. We've seen actions brought against companies. I've seen letters provided to companies based on allegations that they did not address the preference signals. Like, this is something that the AG, I know, is very actively looking at. And it is a really simple thing for the AG to do, because they can look at the website, they can use some simple scanning and say, oh, look, you don't do this. And then you get a letter, which is like a 30-day fix-it ticket right now. But starting in July, because CPRA will no longer have that 30-day fix-it window and enforcement starts, again, in theory, companies could get fined for that, and there could be penalties directly against them. So to me, talking about like low-hanging fruit and something easy to fix, like what you were saying, Ben, like there's no reason not to be doing this, especially since right now the opt-out rates through preference signals are so incredibly low. I think you said like 2 to 3%. Now, if one day Apple decides to integrate it into Safari, that's going to be a very interesting discussion. But for now, because of the way that the signals are operationalized and so limited, I think that it makes full sense for all companies to be addressing it. And of course, there are specifics about what that means with the signal. But Ben, I'm interested to hear kind of like what you're seeing in this. Do you see a lot of companies shifting towards this? Where are you guys at?
So I'm actually going to jump in really quick. We did get a question that I think is really relevant, but somebody asked if somebody can define what a preference signal is. So let's start there, and then.
I mean, that's a great question, because the regs are not fully clear about what that is. But essentially, a preference signal is a signal that is sent through the browser that is communicated to a website. And Ben can talk more technically about this, but that essentially conveys to the website, hey, I want to be opted out. So without having to click the link in the footer, like we were talking about, it essentially automatically operationalizes that. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the back end. One last thing, the major signal that we've seen that's had recognition is called Global Privacy Control, or GPC. But there is question about moving forward about what other signals will need to be recognized by businesses, because the regs don't make that clear. Colorado also requires regs or signals to be recognized, and the AG intends to have a list of signals that companies need to look for. But again, that won't be taking place for a year from now. So we have some time to look at that. So again, Ben, again, if there's any other thoughts you have on this.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so generally across our customer base, the predominant view is that like the signal is referring to global privacy control. Like the regs, or at least the law itself, had like lowercase global privacy control signal, and then there's a signal that came out capital uppercase global privacy control, and like the AG like tweeted about it, and like there's a lot of sort of implicit like support for this. So it seems like that will be the sort of like go forward standard. But to Daniel's point, there are other signals out there that like could sort of represent this. Like for those of us who remember like do not track, like that's another browser signal that's saying like do not track. Does that mean a consumer opt out of the sale of their personal information? So like we like just personally as Transcend, we give our customers the ability to recognize do not track as well as a signal. But the sort of majority considers global privacy control to be like the primary like modern standard for this. And it's certainly the one that's picked up more steam.
And that's
so,
that's
yeah.
real interesting about do not track. I didn't know you guys offered that. I mean, do not track is of course the predecessor from over 10 years ago, which I think was the intent, but never got the same type of traction or requirements. That's why in every privacy policy you see now, it has that language, which basically means nothing, that says, you know, we see do not track signals, but we don't do anything. So you may want to say something, you know, a lot of my clients have updated their privacy policies to say, unless and until required by law. But at this point, my interpretation is do not track is not required as a preference signal. So I do think that's going above and beyond of what you need to do. You may want to, but I don't think you have to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that. The other thing we are seeing is this this move toward the your privacy choices option. So that little blue icon we see on the slide here, along with your privacy choices or your California privacy choices, is like a way of actually getting the do not sell or share my personal information language off of your footer and switching it to something that's a little bit more neutral sounding. And so we're seeing more of that get picked up. And basically clicking that brings up the sort of embedded like option preference center that can say, you know, opt out of this and that. So that's typical. But the really interesting thing that we see with like global privacy control or this opt-out preference signal is it creates just like a kind of new paradigm of like how opt-outs ought to be handled, because for the first time, there's not a user like submitting a form where you have the opportunity to ask for all this extra information and things that would help you actually fulfill and honor their request effectively. And so there's basically two cases that we have to take our customers through. One is you have an anonymous visitor on your website who in their browser has the global privacy control signal enabled. Our technology, so this is again for our customers, we will automatically detect this signal. We will turn off all of the relevant things, such as like sending data to the Facebook pixel or the TikTok pixel or any of these cross-contextual behavioral advertising platforms. And that's great. That's the easy part. The hard part now is like, let's say that user is logged in. That's somebody who like has a real, you know, identity that's been proven to you, and they visit again, and now they have this GPC signal turned on. They've represented to you that they want to opt out of the sale or sharing of their information. So now you actually have to take that signal and you have to match it with the fact that this user has authenticated themselves and we know who they are, they've been identified. And so now we know that like Daniel at FKKS is opted out. And that means we actually have to now go further. So it's not just turning off the Facebook pixel on the front end on this browser, but also like our marketing team tomorrow morning should not take Daniel's email address and put it into Facebook lookalike audiences by hand, right? Which is, you know, a very common process in businesses. There's also automated backend processes in businesses. And so then it becomes this full stack opt-out problem of how do we actually encode this effectively downstream on our backend, on our manual processes, on our CDP, because now that we know that Daniel has opted out, like this is something that we can take a lot further and truly honor this. So it becomes a much more involved problem than the sort of lighter weight or more shallow, like cookie consent type of solution. And now we're talking about like actually reaching back into these backend systems. We have another example of a very large customer who has the goal of not only halting the collection of this data and this sharing it with cross-contextual behavioral advertisers, but also when Daniel opts out, they want to take that one step further and actually pull Daniel out of all of the audience lists on Facebook, on Google, on TikTok, and actually remove him in that event. And so now we're talking about an even more involved flow of like kicking off a backend process that's taking Daniel out of all these different systems as well. So it actually becomes much more involved once you start looking at like the implications of this signal. This is more than just like, this is a sort of evolution beyond just like the sort of old school like form-based opt-out. So super interesting problem. Really excited about kind of all the fun technical problems we get to solve with our customers here. But yeah.
And Ben, I mean, I really like hearing about this when we talk because, and this is again, one reason why I wanted to do this with you is that I like the fact that your solution considers about the scope of the opt-out. As you were mentioning, talking about cookie consent, and I see that that's a question here is, you know, comparing cookie consent preferences to do not sell. Cookie consent is really about that. It's the cookies to say, you know, in like when you opt in or opt out, what happens to the cookies and the tracking technologies on your browser? But do not sell is much broader than that. I mean, the intent of the law is to say, you must opt this person out everywhere, across devices, across browsers associated with the account. So when you read the regs, the way the regs say is it says, you must treat an opt-out signal as a valid opt-out for that browser or device. So again, as you were saying, Ben, I mean, that is technically, that may be easier to operationalize because that's turning off the tracking technologies. But it also is for any consumer profile associated with that browser or device, including a synonymous profile. So if you know that that is also Daniel, then you have to opt them out. So for example, if I'm logged into my account, and this is actually an example that the regs give, when that signal is sent, the company has reason to believe, oh, look, this signal was sent. We don't know specifically that it was Daniel, but we can make an association that he's logged into his account on the site. That needs to be opted out. So what's interesting is, again, then you have to apply that across systems. And I know that this is exactly what the Attorney General is looking for and has been addressing this with companies behind closed doors to figure out how these opt-outs work across ecosystems. One of the interesting things is that, to my understanding, and Ben, maybe you can clarify if not, is that some of these signals do not work on an app environment. It's like an app will actually not recognize it. It's only a website at this point. So that also creates complexity. And I recognize that the Attorney General has said, you know, we don't know what this is going to mean for the long term. And there may be some other technology downstream or down the line that apps will recognize it. But again, to the extent you can link the app to your website, you need to allow for that opt-out. I do not think, to be clear, it requires you to go above and beyond to link them. Like, I'm not saying collect more information than you need in order to make a causal link, because that, I think, again, goes above what the law is requiring. But it is really important to think about the scope here, about what the law.
Yeah, and I, for what it's worth, I think the app thing will come very soon. Apple is pretty cutting edge with this stuff, and they're usually, like, I can imagine, you know, having a little settings page on my phone that just globally turns on this preference signal for all my apps. So I could see that happening. They already have app tracking transparency, which is kind of similar.
But to be clear, that's a really good point. I don't want people to get confused, like complying with app tracking transparency is not complying with do not sell. So it is not the same thing either necessarily. So you need to be very careful about that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. And then just one note on, I know you mentioned like the auditability that the AG has, and in the future, the CPPA. It is extraordinarily easy to see if someone is complying with GPC. In fact, it's so easy that it can be completely automated and scaled out into like a massive web monitoring system. I know this because Transcend has built such a thing. Just for our own research, we're able to continuously scan, many websites and understand whether or not they're implementing GPC. It's very simple to see if that. Basically, you have a server that's running in California. It's in a Chrome browser or in a Firefox browser or something like that. And it's just visiting websites with GPC enabled. And it looks like, is this website sending my data to Facebook or TikTok or what have you? And we're able to do that in such a scaled out way and that took us like, 4 or 5 hours to build. That would be something that the AG could easily do themselves and figure out, who is complying with this law and who is not, like at scale. So it's a very easy thing to actually check in a very automated fashion. So this is definitely something that I view as a priority for our customers. Make sure that you're honoring this like right away, because they're already sending letters, they're already starting to get some enforcement actions going. And it's just so easy to check.
And to just restate that, it's happening. Like, I've seen it, I know it's happening, even though Sephora is really the only public one, there's a lot of it going on right now. So be aware, again, all behind closed doors, but we will see what happens come July, because it does not have to be at that point necessarily. One last thing here that I want to answer a question, which is a great question, saying, well, the regs make it sound like for your privacy choices, in order to do that, it would be only allowed if it is addressing both the do not sell opt-out obligation, as well as the limit the use and disclosure of my sensitive personal information, which is a separate opt-out for sensitive data. And I think, technically speaking, that is an accurate read about the regs say, is that it really is for both. This has not been tested yet, and I've seen a lot of companies rolling it out only for one. I will tell you one reason I like your privacy choices is that under other regulatory frameworks like Colorado also is going to require an opt-out link. And so to me, having something like this that unifies and harmonizes the various things in one location is really helpful. So I think going again to what the spirit of the law is, this would be, again, an argument that I would have to say why I think there's a basis to say even if you don't have the limit the use of SPI, you could still do this. But again, that's my interpretation. I'm not saying that that's perfect, and that may very well not be what the Attorney General says, but it's something to be tested. We will see.
Yeah, for what it's worth, like if you think about like the spirit of it, like I can't imagine that being a major priority.
Alrighty, so I'm gonna move on in the interest of time, but we've talked about do not sell or share, like having the 2 links, having your privacy choices link, and in the regs, there's also this concept of frictionless opt-out, just to add more fun to the game. But Daniel, can you talk about what frictionless opt-outs entail and if that's a reasonable option for most businesses?
Yeah, so I think this is something we can talk about pretty quickly. It basically is another option that the regs set out that say, if the only type of sales that you're doing or shares are really in the context of targeted ads through pixels and tracking technologies on your site, and there is no other method, like you don't really offer any type of financial incentives or anything else that is complex that may contradict that, then you can actually have this frictionless opt-out where you don't have to offer the button on the bottom of your website, and that you essentially can just do like what Ben was saying, you can honor these signals when they come through. To be honest, I don't have very many clients, if any, that I can think of that have done this at this point, because I think that it's just not realistic. So where I would see this being maybe helpful is you're a blog, like you're a super small site, and you have some targeted advertising pixels on your site that you're dealing with Facebook. And so you just want to have it like, oh, we're going to honor the frictionless. We don't want the do not sell button. But most companies that I'm dealing with, and Ben, I'm curious to hear what you have to say, are dealing with first party data sets, have account information, could have pseudonymous profiles. And so this is just not enough to cut it for them. So it's an interesting option, but how much it will actually be leveraged, I think, is TBD.
Yeah, I concur. It's a rarer case where it applies, and like even that small blog, like there's also thresholds in CPRA that like a lot of them wouldn't even apply. So it's just kind of a weird like it's a small segment that could apply to. That we could completely see the same stuff there.
Awesome, thanks, super helpful. So our last topic is consumer rights and consumer requests. And the CPRA added a few new rights and then expanded some others. Daniel, can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so for those of you who are familiar with the regs from CCPA, I mean, there's very robust requirements around how to operationalize responding to requests. And when I say requests, Ben and I have already talked about the do not sell. I think of these as the more traditional DSAR requests, access and deletion. There's some new language in there around deletion where you actually have to notify service providers when you receive a deletion request. So essentially it's pushing those obligations down on service providers. Interestingly enough, you also are supposed to notify all third parties to whom you've sold personal information if you receive a deletion request to tell them to delete it, unless that proves impossible or involves disproportionate effort. So that's an interesting kind of twist here, because it's not just for deletion either. The other new one that we've seen is in the context of correction. So that's an addition that was not found in the original CCPA or CCPA regs. And essentially, it's exactly what you'd think it would be, right? There's a right to correct information. You have to notify service providers, like similar to what I said for deletion. There's a whole process for it, which I'm sure, Ben, you guys have studied very carefully around how to deal with that. But the devils are in the details. I recommend looking at the CPRA regs about how to do that. One of the interesting things that I want to note about it is that for correction requests, if you correct something and then down the line you get additional information from a data broker that like basically resets the information the newly corrected information, so you replace it with wrong information, that is a consideration that the AG will look at to say, did you really fully comply with the correction request because you reverted it once you got revised data that you should have known is inaccurate? Interesting nuance to see how that's operationalized, but Ben, interested to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, maybe I'll just start on the sort of all of the consumer requests like access, erasure, and so forth. I think the important thing to know, like when operationalizing this, is that like privacy is really like fundamentally it's a data problem more than just like a legal. It's not something that could just be solved by the legal office. It's something that like is completely scales with the size of like your data stack. And so if you're a business that has thousands of data systems or thousands of vendors, like you really need to be thinking about like operationalizing at the data layer and not like the people layer. So sending people on a bunch of like wild goose chases every time a user gets asked for a copy of their data or asked to delete their data, it becomes ludicrous over time, as we've seen. So and frankly, it's just not going to happen. Like if you have to tap like your VP of sales every time someone says delete me to go log into Salesforce and find this person and delete them, like realistically, that's not happening at the level that it should be. And this is where you need to start thinking about actually installing infrastructure. So this is actually where Transcend started, for what it's worth. We started as building this like single delete button that reaches into all of your systems and sweeps out one person's data. And so we've like really thought about this. We started with the GDPR standard, and that is obviously a very high bar. That is something that really kind of goes beyond just like the sort of perhaps slightly lighter weight things around notification of vendors or things like that. And it's like you're liable for the actual deletion out of these data processors in Europe. And so all this is to say, like, in terms of operationalizing, like the thing to operationalize is the actually getting connected into this data and actually governing personal data in the system rather than knowing who the point of contact is that you need to shoulder tap whenever you need something. Now, for the right to correct, this is an interesting one, and I'll maybe just make 2 points here. So first is like it's usually not something that should happen through a flow that looks or feels like the access or delete flow. So those are like buttons or forms that like exist at the company where it's like, ask us for a copy of your data, ask us to delete your data. And that's usually like this whole like zone where users go for privacy purposes. Right to correct, like 99% of the time should be just a part of like the existing like product. If we're talking about like like let's say it's an app, let's say you work at an app company, like 99% of the stuff that can be corrected should be like user settings and not things that have to go through the privacy office saying like, hey, like I have a privacy request to like change my home address because like you're going to ship this to the wrong place. Like that's all stuff that should be like really done at like a product level or otherwise like at like a client services level. And so 99% of the time we see that go that way. But there is still that like sort of long tail reason why you may need to have like a form-based thing where privacy office is still the wheelhouse of correction. And that's usually where there's like some very serious sort of like legal implication of having that data be incorrect. So if you are a credit bureau, right, and you have a false credit pull or something like that, or there's a loan that's inaccurate on your credit report, that has very serious downstream effect. And that's usually the case where we'll see something like a really like built out or meaningful right to correct that where the privacy office is indeed the wheelhouse. And for what it's worth, this is also something that's reflected in EU law and in other regions where in Europe, it's I think it's rectification is the word they'll use, but it's essentially the same idea. And for what it's worth, we just see like several orders of magnitude more volume on deletion requests, and like maybe 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more on an access request, and then like the very odd right to correct request, and it's usually dependent on the business. So that's what I'll say on those two. And then maybe just like one final thing is like there's now also authorized agents as it relates to consumer requests. And actually, maybe Daniel, do you want to spend a quick beat on just what that is, and then I can kind of talk about operationalizing?
We could do a whole session talking just about the authorization, Ben. You're saying this in the last like 10 seconds or whatever. Basically, the idea is that somebody has the ability to exercise requests on your behalf. And so the law requires you to facilitate that. Now, there are limitations, and you can actually set what the parameters are to say, oh, you have to submit through this method, which is one of the nice things that I'm seeing a lot of companies do under California. But we've seen a whole industry be created around these authorized agents. So that is a very kind of big area that everybody's thinking about.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what I'll say here is that authorized agents and the process around it, it's still early days because clearly it's not working in the way that it's intended to. And I mean, as somebody who cares a lot about data rights, like I think it's a very cool concept for me as an individual to be able to, really effectively submit requests in a way that feels more standard as me, the consumer. But it's very, very much a fundamentally broken process, because the issue, if you're the business receiving this request, is you don't know if this is like a trustworthy agent of this person. Like, this is like the easiest way to have a data breach, is just like somebody said, like, I go to, you know, Equifax and I say, I represent Daniel, like, please give me his, like, all of his financial information. Like, hopefully Equifax is going to be like, hold up, like, we need some more proof of that, and we need to like actually get some sign off from Ben. We need to actually like verify that Ben is Ben and it's not like some forgery. Like, there's just so many security issues with this flow, where what we see is most companies will say, like, that does not outweigh our breach and security risk, and we're going to basically like send a lot of this back and say, like, we're happy to fulfill this. Let's talk to Ben and have him actually verify these steps, or like, let's talk to the actual data subject question here and make sure that they can prove their identity in some form. And so that is where we're at today. Now, I think where we're going is we're going to be able to get to a place where there's more like modern security embedded in that, where there's a whole like well-established like thing with identity verification and cryptography and signatures and things that like actually prove that, you know, Ben proved his identity, right? And so we need to get to that point before companies can actually reasonably like take these requests at face value. So we're working on a protocol for this. It's an open standard that is in a draft state right now. We're working with Consumer Reports and some others on something called the Data Rights Protocol. But my hope is that one day we'll actually get to a place where this is much more streamlined. It's not just, you know, sending thousands of emails at the privacy at inbox, which inevitably have to be sort of redirected into an auth flow. But yeah, this is an area to watch, and I'm very curious to see how regulators approach it, because there is such a like, there's a security risk that's like really outweighing the sort of, you know, the frictionless desire that consumers and probably regulators have as well.
Completely agree, Ben. And I think also a lot of it is spam almost, right? Where you just see these like mass sending. So once we get a better process for it, I think that will be helpful. So glad to hear you guys are working on that.
Awesome. Well, so we do have 2 questions. Try to get to, oh, there's a third. I don't know if we'll get through all of these, but I want to get through at least one. Daniel said it's more harmful in some cases to have a cookie banner in the US, but how are companies doing notice of collection if not with a cookie banner?
So this is a good question. And actually, Morgan, I read this as being the second question too. They're kind of connected. So the law basically is saying that you need to have this notice of collection, which California says, you know, it has to lead specifically to the section of the California privacy policy, so California specific disclosures. So what most companies are doing is in the footer, they're putting this California privacy notice, and then you click on it and it goes to the section of the privacy policy talking about California. Now, there is an interpretation that some have had that says, well, you also need to have this just-in-time notice at the point of collection, which potentially could be through like through a banner pop-up. Realistically, I have not seen that being operationalized, and I think there's a lot of basis for not doing that. It seems to go a little bit above and beyond from what I've seen, and I'm not aware of the regulators specifically at this point requiring that. I don't know, Ben, if you've seen companies doing that, but for the most part, in my opinion, the way I read it, I think that if you have that link in the footer to the California specific section along with the do not sell, that should be sufficient to address the obligations under California law. Again, hasn't been fully tested, but this is what I'm seeing right now. That's a line you haven't seen, like the extra notice of collection in like a pop-up, right?
Not really. I mean, I attribute most of the pop-ups still to the kind of GDPR inertia. But yeah, so I would agree. And then I also think just sometimes as part of product experiences, like if you're about to enter a new section, which would activate some new data flows, that may also have some language, kind of just like right on the, it's like a disclosure of like that you see anywhere in products today. But yeah,
Agreed.
I don't see it as like pop-ups.
And I think with respect to when you think about, if we talk about additional just-in-time notice, going to that point before, it really is around sensitive data sets. And especially if you're intending to use it around for like a secondary use that would not be, that the consumer wouldn't necessarily expect, right? And so that goes to what I was talking about, the reasonable expectation test. And we always see that great example from, back in the day at the FTC about saying, oh, you're a flashlight app, but then you're also collecting geolocation data to send it for targeted for advertising. Like that's not something you would be thinking that the two would be together.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. We are at time, so I'm gonna call it. But Danielle, I do see your question, and we will follow up with you after the fact. But Daniel, Ben, is there any closing remarks you guys want to close with?
No, just thanks, Daniel, for coming. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for sharing such awesome knowledge with us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and just wanted to say to everybody, this is great. Thank you guys all for attending. Like this is moving very fast. If Ben and I gave this presentation in 2 months, like I know we're recording this today, but this may be totally outdated. To Danielle's question, she was asking about ad tech DSPs. That is a whole, just the ad tech industry. So I'm very involved in ad tech. Is working really diligently to try to figure out how to address a lot of this. I think what IAB is doing with the MSPA has been very positive. And I know, Ben, you guys are also, talking to IAB and involvement. So for those of you that are dealing with that, I think that's a very good resource to look at because again, I really like what they're doing. But again, we will continue talking about harmonization and everything. And if anyone has any questions that we didn't answer today, I tried to get to everything. Please feel free to reach out. I would love to chat. Thank you. And thank you, Transcend, for hosting.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.